Greetings, students, friends, colleagues, both here in the audience and across the world on the web. My name is Dr. Tolga Esmer. I work in the Department of History here at CEU. I'm also the former director of, in fact, one of the founding members of the Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies here at CEU. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Yektan Türkyılmaz. Dr. Turkyılmaz received his Ph.D. from the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke University. He's taught across the globe at schools such as Sabancı, Bilgi, and Duke universities, the California State University system, as well as the University of Cyprus, addressing debates around notions of collective violence, memory making and reconciliation, and the politics of music. More recently, Dr. Türkyılmaz has been a UME fellow between 2017 and 21 at the Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin. He's currently on a postdoc here at CEU's Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies. He's now working on his book manuscript entitled Rethinking Genocide, Violence and Victimhood in Eastern Anatolia, 1913-1915, that addresses the early 20th century conflict in Eastern Anatolia, along with the memory politics that revolve around it up to today. And so Dr. Türkyılmaz is furthermore a well-known commentator on contemporary Turkish politics. Judging from the gossip in our corridors that I'm hearing in the department, our students are already very excited about the prospects of his teaching next year here at CEU. So please join your hands together to welcome Dr. Türkyılmaz, who will now give his lecture entitled Reassessing the Route to the Armenian Genocide, June 1913 to April 1915.
Thank you very much, Olga, for this lovely introduction, a generous introduction. And thank you very much for being here this evening with me. I would like to start with today's event, actually. It's a feast of faith. I will be talking about a war 108 years ago, a European war, and unfortunately today we find ourselves in the middle of another one. And I would like to start expressing that my heart goes out to Ukrainian people who are suffering under the expansionist aggression of a despotic leader today. So, let me begin with a vignette. This is August 16, 1914. Only 1 second. Yes. Yes. Oops. Yeah. Only a few days after the outbreak of World War I, two prominent members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Dashnak Sutyun, Armengaro, and Vartya Serengulyan, visited Kirkorzora, a renowned Armenian intellectual and politician, at his rented house on Büyükada, the little island in the Sea of Marmara of Istanbul. These three notable Armenian political figures had also been members of the Ottoman Parliament after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. That evening, they decided to write down their predictions for the war as kind of a strange parlor game. At the war's end, they agreed the losers would pay for a dinner party for the winner and 12 of his friends at Istanbul's famous Tokatlian Hotel. Here are the questions of the parlor game. Let me quickly read them for you. First, will the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, or Triple Alliance, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Italy win? Second, will the victory be major and overwhelming or a matter of gaining advantages? Third, how long will it last until the signing of a political treaty? Four, will small Balkan states and Turkey participate in the war? 5, will internal insurgency break out in Turkey or not? 6, will Turkey gain or lose from the restoration of peace regarding its territorial makeup and political rights? 7, What will be the situation of Armenians during the war? What will be the course of Turkish Armenians in case of a Russo-Turkish war? Will they cross to the Russian side or not? What will happen to Armenians of Central Anatolia, Cilicia, and Istanbul? And finally, question 8, will Turkish Armenians come out as political winners or losers when peace is restored? In retrospect, these questions seem horribly naive. Paradoxically, these men had political interactions and personal friendships with the young Turk leaders who only months later would order and oversee their killings. As you can see, the Parlor game questions clearly reflect how hazy and invisible the horizons for the Armenian political leadership, the direction of broader international geopolitical prospects, their potential repercussions for domestic politics, and finally, the impact on the Ottoman Armenians all were unknowns. Now, let's look at their responses. I marked similar responses in same color. Ironically, the answers given by the three political leaders differed on all questions except one. On question 8, all of them guessed that Armenians in the Ottoman Empire would politically benefit from the war. The question that incited the deepest anxiety and the fear were the ones concerning the fate of Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Armenians. More specifically, how would the war affect the empire and whether a new wave of Armenian massacres follow. Zohrab and Armengaro thought the Ottoman Empire would come out of the war as a territorial and political loser. Vargas predicted the opposite. On the fate of Ottoman Armenians, Vargas and Armengaro felt that a new wave of massacres was not possible. Zohrab thought that Armenians living near the border and Russia would seek refuge across the border, and there would only be partial massacres and lootings in other areas of the empire. Zohrab won the bet posthumously, having foreseen the coming massacres, if not in their full scale and brutality. But he never enjoyed the dinner party prize. He and Vargas were arrested in May 1915 and sent to Diyarbakir for military trial. A Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, hitman Ahmet the Circassian, Cerkez Ahmet, tortured them to death on the way near the city of Urfa. Of the three, only Armengaro survived the genocide. He went to the Caucasus just weeks after the fateful last dinner to help organize the Armenian volunteer battalions. He was in the Russian-controlled territories when the widespread persecution of Ottoman Armenian notables and intellectuals began on April 24, 1915. Armenian genocide is one of the most horrifying tragedies of the 20th century. Within a year, over 1 million Ottoman Armenians, amounting to more than 20% of the entire Armenian population in the world, was decimated by the CUP government in the Ottoman Empire. By late October 1914, initial warning signs of catastrophe came from the clashes and escalating violence in northern Iran. At the end of the month, the Ottoman Empire attacked Russia and joined the war, and soon after clashes began along the Caucasian border. By late November 1914, following the retreat of Russian troops, the specter of the genocidal extermination first showed its face in Bashkala and Saray, located in the eastern districts of one province bordering Iran. As Armenian historian Leo observed, that those massacres were unlike the usual Russo-Turkish wartime looting and killing of Armenians, as all Armenians were being put to sword. The carnage came to a halt after January 1915, yet meanwhile, the jure and de facto measures of discrimination and persecution of Ottoman Armenians had been put into motion. These included the disarming of Armenian soldiers, the removal of Armenians from government posts, travel restrictions, and selective arrest and execution of suspected political activists. In spring of 1915, a second Russian incursion into northern Iran and the Ottoman eastern provinces paved the way for the final catastrophic outcome. 4 days after the Armenian uprising in Van broke out on April 24, 1915, the government rounded up some 250 Armenian notables, intellectuals, clergymen, and political leaders in Istanbul. They were moved and incarcerated in central Anatolia. Only a handful survived. Finally, on May 29, 1915, government passed the infamous temporary law of deportation, Tehcir Kanunu. The law made no explicit mention of Armenians, yet the target was evident. The final destination for the deportees was Deir ez-Zor, in what is today eastern Syria by the Euphrates. Only Armenians from Istanbul, Izmir, the areas under the Russian occupation, and a few other regions escaped the forced removals. The deportations were often accompanied by looting, killing of able-bodied adult men, and the abduction of children and young women. The massacres also included the systemic extermination of almost all Armenian conscripts in the Ottoman army, who had already been disarmed, actually. Many refugees perished on the way due to harsh weather conditions, continuous attacks, and starvation. Those who reached Deir ez-Zor had to deal with the famine and contagious diseases, which took a further toll on the already traumatized survivors. Contrary to the denialist rhetoric, which frames the genocidal policies as a measure against Armenian wartime insurgency, the annihilation of Armenians was carried out almost without any organized resistance, except few locations such as Van, Şevinkarahisar, Urfa, and evidence that the Ottoman Armenians were caught by total surprise and had no preparations against such an exterminationist campaign. By the end of 1916, thousands of years of Armenian presence in the Ottoman eastern provinces, areas which many geographers and historians called historic Armenia, or the Armenian plateau, was virtually extinguished. Further, even a quick examination of the history of the Armenian question in the Ottoman Empire before 1915 documents a long and grave record of violence, widespread assaults and the appropriation of Armenian properties by the Kurds since the 1860s. The Hamidian pogroms spread all over the Ottoman territories between 1894-96, and the most recently massacres in Adana in 1909. If one adds to this already gloomy picture an erratic ruling elite, which became increasingly radicalized and suspicious about the loyalty of its Christian subjects after the humiliating losses and defeats in the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, the path to the genocide seemed not to demand any further explanation. Given such a telling record, how can we then make sense of the Parlor game? Shall we assume that these most prominent Armenian politicians of the time, with personal connections to the young Turk leaders, were simply naive? Or was the government's premeditation so secretive that they could not see what was about to happen? Or did World War I simply spark pre-existing and accumulating destructive energies? There is one tacit assumption that all these questions that are in fact reflective of existing threads of Armenian genocide historiography share, namely that there was already an escalating conflict regarding the Armenian question when the war began. This assumption fits within a larger tendency in genocide studies, what I call the escalation bias. That is a tendency to focus on the factors that led to genocide over those that militated against it. Whatever pertains to peace and possibility of de-escalation, in other words, is often downplayed, ignored, or left unnoticed in the historical discourses produced around the genocide. A view of escalation as an ideologically, politically, and socially foreordained process is so normalized in Armenian genocide scholarship that even those like David Luxem, who have raised fundamental challenges to teleological and deterministic explanations, concur that, I quote, on the eve of the First World War, the empire and its Armenian population stood on the edge of a precipice, unquote. Today, I would like to first speak about the eve of the genocide. That is the period between the Balkan Wars and World War I, from June 1913 to August 1914, and argue that despite the widespread scholarly consensus, this period was not characterized by a linear polarization or inevitable escalation. Many genocide scholars have demonstrated genocides are usually unpredictable events. Yet I deduce that the Armenian genocide is one of those few cases which was not only unpredictable, but was completely unexpected for the victims who were caught entirely unprepared to exterminationist policies. But why is the escalation bias so seductive for genocide scholars in general and in the Armenian case in particular? One cause of this bias is surely that to study genocide is to study hatred, dehumanization, violence, and destruction in its most severe, exceptional, and unthinkable form, and thus seems to demand the reassurance of explanation. Genocide scholars commit themselves to the grueling task of deciphering genocide, that is, seeking to crack the code of the horrifyingly unimaginable through a comparative investigation of various cases. Then, too, genocide studies have been concerned with the question of prediction. Sociologist Thomas Cushman points out that the field of genocide studies implicitly and explicitly holds the conviction that by cracking the codes of genocide, we can predict and help design mechanisms to prevent it. I concur with Cushman that this assumption overlooks the most salient qualities of genocide, namely, I quote, its contingency, unpredictability, and its status as a product of human agency, unquote. The suggestion that genocide is unpredictable bears crucial theoretical implications. First, no genocide is an a priori given. Structural factors are necessary, but never sufficient conditions. Further, human agency in genocidal processes depends on forces that often go beyond any sense of rational action. Hence, genocides are not inevitable events. Even after a conflict enters its danger zone, all red flags flying, the process can still back towards de-escalation. Genocide scholar and political scientist Barbara Harp, in fact, asks, I quote, how many times have we discovered that all conditions specified are present, yet somehow an apparently escalating crisis fizzled due to some unanticipated event, unquote. Even in cases ending in a genocide, the onset of violence is not characterized solely by increased conflict or escalation. What I term escalation bias, on the other hand, enacts a teleology of genocide, which renders alternative scenarios impossible. It downplays political agency, reconstructing genocide as an inevitable outcome, and perhaps most importantly, it muddies the issue of responsibility. This form of explanation searches out aggressive discursive formulations and policy blueprints, and then uses them as evidence for the veracity of the escalation narrative, counting down towards the inevitable conclusion. Within this framework, I want to make three interrelated points to argue for and explain the unexpectedness of the Armenian genocide for the victims. First, that the post-Balkan Wars was a period when the Ottoman Armenian public opinion was by and large characterized by optimistic prospects. Second, I will suggest that political competition and contestation among the Armenian political elites, government, and European powers did not create a deadlock with a consequent aggressive polarization between the Ottoman state and Armenian communities. I will do so by briefly discussing the Eastern Anatolian planned debates. Finally, I will turn to the on-the-ground situation in the Armenian provinces and show how an emergent expectation of a Russian-sponsored Kurdish insurgency indeed created conditions of cooperation between the Ottoman state and Armenian community leaders. The parlor game that I opened my talk with illustrates prevalent optimism among the Armenian political elite in the capital. But let me try to make my point about optimism even bolder. In October 1914, 2 months after the above parlor game, a reception was held in honor of Tahsin Bey, the former government, at the mansion of Set Kapamajian in Van. In his memoirs, Terzibashian, a prominent businessman, recounts that after he delivered a speech to the guests consisted of Muslims and Armenian notables of the city, asserting the devotion of Armenians to the Ottoman homeland and toasted to the empire. And just as he finished, Ömer Naci Bey, part of CEUP's, that is Italy's core leadership, and a renowned young Turk agitator, whispered into Terzibashian's ears, I quote, "You are fooling yourself," unquote. After stating the government's suspicions regarding Armenian revolutionaries' pro-Russian activities in the Caucasus, Ömer Naci went on to warn Terzibashian. I quote, "We will participate in the war against the Entente powers. If Armenians support the Russians, we will massacre them. We will slaughter them ruthlessly, without remorse, without concern for consequences. We will kill even the host of our table, whose champagne we are drinking at the moment," unquote. Ömer Naci's words shocked Terzibashian. The next morning, he hurried to Arshak Vramyan, the Dashnak deputy to the Ottoman parliament from Van, to inform him about the incident. When heard this story, Vramyan shrugged his shoulders and said, "He is crazy and a drunkard," unquote. Vramyan had been one of the key figures in the Dashnak CUP negotiations regarding the war policies in and after August 1914. And yet he too had no foreshadowing of what was to come. Like Vargas and Zora, Vramyan would also become an early high-profile victim of the genocide, only 6 months after this exchange. I have been researching the early 20th century violence in Eastern Anatolia for over a decade, working on the Armenian, Ottoman, American missionary, and British archives, as well as examining printed material, primary material such as memoirs, periodicals. When I first started my research, I was personally shocked and intellectually puzzled to find these repeated examples of optimism expressed by Armenian elites and public figures, even after the World War I broke out. Let me be clear here. These are not rare or outlying examples that I handpicked to make my point. On the contrary, these expressions reflected the general outlook. As Simon Vratian, an official Dashnak party historian, also retrospectively summarized, even with the outbreak of World War I, most believed, I quote, "In front of the Armenian people was rising a new, unlimited, and fascinating horizon," unquote. A very common presumed tipping point towards escalation in the current historiography is the Balkan Wars. The Ottoman army fought in the Balkan Wars against a coalition of ex-subject Bulgarian, Serbian, Greek, Montenegrin armies. The result was humiliating for the empire. First, over 85% of the empire's European territories were lost. Second, the political turmoil led to the influx of desperate, tormented, and enraged Balkan Muslims, radically changing the demographic configuration of the empire in the remaining territories. For the proponents of the escalation approach, the humiliating defeat of the Ottoman Empire marked a watershed regarding the conflict in Eastern Anatolia. What followed is treated as a politics of confrontation, a process of escalation which continued until the genocide. This narrative underscores the ideological radicalization of Turkish nationalist thinkers, after the tragedy of the Balkan Wars, interrelatedly, it foregrounds the tensions produced by the implementation of radically exclusionary economic and administrative Turkification measures by the central government. And finally, it focuses on the fear of disintegration among the CUP elite produced in the diplomatic dogfight generated by the Eastern Anatolian Reform Project, with the CUP coming to see Ottoman Armenians as and their political organizations as agents of destruction. Let me be clear. I do not dispute that these conditions contributed to making genocide possible. But my analysis goes further to ask, first, whether these dynamics had the same effect on the Armenian question or in eastern provinces as they did on other groups or geographical areas of the empire. And second, if the only consequence of the various changing developments in the Balkan Wars and afterwards was more conflict in the region. My research has led me to conclude that as far as the political debates and on-the-ground situation in Eastern Anatolian provinces are concerned, the period between June 1913 and August 1914 was, in fact, no one escalating conflict. To be more precise, there was no indication of aggression that emanated from a single source, steadily increased over time or directed against one precisely targeted group. Crucially, in other words, the political configuration in the period still offered manifold choices for the actors involved. It was a moment not of foreordained tragedy, but rather uncertainties, contingencies that involved both centrifugal as well as centripetal forces at both intra-communal scales. Further, in the eastern provinces, there was no signs of deterioration of intercommunal relations, general security or conditions of Armenians. To the contrary, ironically, there were signs of improvement as reflected in various episodes during the period. The post-Balkan Wars Ottoman state presented a weak, ailing, and at times easily provoked ideological and bureaucratic network. It resembles nothing as much as a delicate chess game where the Istanbul government did not have the resources and self-confidence to pursue a strategic or ideological line of action in Eastern Anatolia. Instead, with its limited resources and without power of effective enforcement, the CUP government tried very cautiously to first prove to its public and to the international actors that it was still a viable sovereign state. Second, preclude any chaos in the eastern provinces that would lead to increased diplomatic pressures and perhaps Russian military intervention. And finally, to cultivate as much support as possible among the Armenians and Kurds alike, in order to undermine any tendencies toward seeking cross-border alliances, especially with or within Russia. One major piece of escalation argument is the Eastern Anatolian reform debates. Diplomatic talks among European powers on how to improve the conditions of security of life, dignity, and property for Armenians and other minority groups in the Ottoman Eastern provinces. The reform issue, indeed, by and large, reshaped and determined the terms of Eastern Anatolian question in the post-Balkan Wars period. On July 4, 1913, after extensive preparations, ambassadors of 6 great powers, England, Russia, Germany, France, Italy, and Austria, convened in Istanbul to discuss the Russian plan. A final draft was agreed upon after a harsh bargaining between Russian and German representatives on February 8, 1914. The major reason why the Eastern Anatolian reform process did not lead to the presumed escalation is that when the reform talks ended, as historian Frederick Davidson concluded, there were no losers. Here, without going into details, I would like to turn to the same Ömer Naci, who threatened Terzibashian with massacre about, this time on the reform question. On December 16, 1913, towards the end of reform debates, in an interview, Ömer Naci expressed his trust to Armenians and their most organized political party, Taşnak Sökül, and said, he, I quote, was convinced that so long as the cultural identity and national rights of Armenian people are respected, the ultimate objective of the Armenian community is to remain as a loyal Ottoman constituency, unquote. The Yektan Agreement produced at the end of the negotiations divided Ottoman eastern provinces into two sections. The northern provinces, Sivas, Erzurum, Trabzon, and southern provinces, Mamluk Aziz, Diyarbakir, Bitlis, and Van. Each region would be under the rule of separate European general inspectors. The creation of two separate zones rather than uniting the six eastern provinces under one territorial unit and calling it Armenian province was a major challenge to the Russian plan. Hence, the Yektan Agreement, despite the earlier fears of the CUP government, made it harder to imagine that reforms would be a clear step towards the establishment of an Armenian political entity under Russian protection. Second, the agreement did not make any specific reference to Armenian question, but rather mentioned religious, national, and linguistic groups without naming them. And perhaps most importantly, Western control over the implementation of reforms, which was a major point of objection for the Ottoman representatives, was diluted down to inspection and supervision. Therefore, reforms did not signal an absolute victory or defeat for any party, leaving one side bitter or angered. The table was still open for bargaining, contestation, as well as compromise. This situation is perhaps best illustrated in February 27, 1914, dispatch of Armenian Patriarch Zaven to all prelates of the eastern provinces. I quote, "This agreement, which contains only the fundamental points of the Armenian reforms, do not satisfy our entire national demands. But we can also say that this is a first step. In spite of concurring that extreme enthusiasm is detrimental, it is necessary to fully comprehend and appreciate the real value of the acquired in order to utilize and realize it accordingly." Underlined in the original, unquote. Here, let me turn to the on-the-ground situation in eastern provinces and explain how, although invisible in Armenian genocide historiography, emerging dynamics were also enabling increased collaboration between Armenian political elites and Ottoman and the government against a third group, pro-Russian Kurds. I would like to open a parenthesis here. Kurdish groups have been a major party involved in the history of Armenian question. Since the Berlin Treaty of 1878, they had been categorically deemed as unruly and bloody oppressors, looters and murderers, preying on Christians in general and Armenians in particular. The 1894-96 Hamidian pogroms reinforced this image as well as adding a new dimension to it. Due to the systemic involvement of Kurds in the massacres, they had commonly been depicted as a tool in the hands of the Ottoman state that the latter utilizes to terrorize Armenians. Yet my research shows that the post-Balkan War relations among the state authorities and Armenian communities and Kurdish groups challenged this tautological and simplistic representation. In this period, Tsarist Russia initiated a policy of supporting anti-government Kurdish movements in the Ottoman Empire as part of the endeavor to increase its influence in Eastern Anatolia. In turn, Kurdish notables such as Simko, Abdurrazak Bedirkhan, Kur Hüseyin Pasha, and Sevim Taha began to seek Russian support for their political agendas. At this historical conjuncture, that in addition to the Armenian question and Eastern question, a new axis of debate began to become visible, namely the Kurdish question. The situation created enormous anxiety in Istanbul, and it was also a major concern in British, German, and Armenian political circles. Hence, the specter of a wholesale and possibly cross-border Kurdish rebellion haunted their diplomatic communication and political strategies. Until World War I, nervousness regarding such a revolt marked the Kurdish threat as more immediate and urgent than an Armenian conspiracy for the Ottoman government. A key political consequence was to open up fresh discursive space for Armenian public figures to portray Armenians as the true Ottoman patriotic people of the eastern provinces against the Kurdish-Russian alliance. As the government's anxiety brewed and it began to take a more aggressive attitude against certain Kurdish tribes and notables, the Ottoman Armenian media celebrated the fact that eventually the government had come to see what they described as the perils of politics of lenience against the Kurdish troublemakers in the East. In an article titled Necessary Austerity, which appeared in the Istanbul-based liberal Armenian paper Byzantion on August 9, 1913, Buzan Keşan commented on an official press release that warned of a brewing Kurdish conspiracy. I quote, "The Armenian newspapers, which have reported the Kurdish disturbances day by day, have the consciousness of having committed their patriotic duties. Our protest has been against the bloody bandit elements of the Kurds, who can also create immense perils for the state. These Kurdish brigands, who have to be eradicated, are not ordinary bandits, but at the same time, tools in the hands of the foreigners, i.e. Russians," unquote. At a time when the Western powers were debating the reform plan in eastern provinces, news of violence and insecurity in the region would definitely strengthen Russia's hands. This concern, multiplied by the suspicion of a Russian-backed Kurdish insurgency, permitted the government to spread its fight against Kurdish opponents. The government press bureau frequently released news about arrests of Kurdish fugitives in Van, Bitlis, Dersim, and other areas. On September 14, 1913, less than 2 months after the above article was published, Byzantine correspondent reported from Van. I quote, "The famous brigand Shakirov Krav and his guards have been killed. 2 of his sons have been wounded, and 4 or 5 guards were arrested with his sons and his brother. This is serious news. Don't think that it's unbelievable news. The news is true, and for the past 3 days, a source of joyful excitement for the entire city of Van. Governor Tahsin Bey has proven his influence and saved the government's prestige. The Armenian community is pleased by the determination he demonstrated," unquote. This feared great Kurdish rebellion was thought to have materialized in spring of 1914. On April 1st, the Armenian papers in Istanbul announced unrest among the Kurds of Bitlis and panic among the local Armenians. In the early days after the short-lived mutiny, the government, the Armenian and Turkish papers concurred that it was a movement against the reform plan. The Armenian language papers, Azadamat, Jamanak, Byzantion, were pointing to a larger scheme or plot, which might even have had foreign fingerprints, that is, Russian fingerprints. Interestingly enough, the rebels, despite being believed to be religious zealots, were extremely meticulous about not attacking non-Muslims or on their way or in the city. It was also reported that many Kurdish insurgents went to say farewell to their Armenian neighbors before leaving their villages to join the rebellion. Later, it turned out that they had contacted the Armenian prelate and asked for Armenian support in hope of creating a united front against the government. A high-ranking official told the editor of Turkish daily Tasviri Efkar that two letters were dispatched by the masterminds of the revolt. One addressed to the Armenian prelate, full of assurances of goodwill towards Armenians, and the other letter addressed to the Ottoman governor, this one full of insults. Likewise, the Armenian prelate in Bitlis, Kalemian, wrote in a report addressed to the Armenian patriarch that despite his worries, the attitude of the Kurds to Armenians during the mutiny had been very positive. I raised the Kurdish rebellion in Bitlis because it once again suggested how contingent and fluid the relations among the government, Kurdish notables, and Armenians in the area were. The governor, Masar Bey, was dismissed as soon as the Kurdish insurgency broke out. Once the newly appointed governor, Abdülhalik Renda, arrived, he did not hesitate to distribute 150 rifles and 10 bins of bullets to the Armenians so that they could defend themselves and the city against the rebels. Let me say this once again. An Ottoman administrator was giving guns to Armenians only 6 months before their systemic persecution began. I have to also remind you that this infamous Abdülhalik Renda would be one of the major perpetrators who was in charge of the extermination of Armenians of Bitlis a few months later. This rebellion united public voices from diverse strata of Ottoman society around a display of support to the reform plan, which until recently had been subject to heated debates and disagreement. For instance, even the pro-CUP, that is pro-İttihat, daily Tasfiye Etiyar, pointed out the rebellion as a proof of necessity for reforms. Liberal Turkish daily Peyam exalted the Armenian loyalty and support to the government at such a time of crisis. I quote, "If there is any light in the midst of the darkness surrounding the same areas again, it is that this time we find our Armenian compatriots, together with the enlightened minds, stand on the side of the government. Now every Ottoman citizen who feels affection for her homeland should wish that the reform plan be implemented instantaneously." Unquote. Likewise, the French language pro-government Turkish paper, Yektan Türkyılmaz, after praising the Armenians loyal to the government during the insurrection, took the Armenians to have expressed, I quote, "their confidence about those who are at the head of the country's governance, since under the current circumstances, only the current government can overcome the work of renaissance of the country." Unquote. The pro-Tashnak paper Ashkadan in one responded to Yektan Türkyılmaz article in an editorial, "Armenian lawfulness." I quote, "The example of witness is not the first and will not be the last, because Armenians, as it has been the case in the past, in the future too, will be in the first ranks among the nations constituting the empire in performing its patriotic responsibilities, if the chance is given." Unquote. These examples further evidence that regarding intercommunal relations and security situation in the eastern provinces, there was no sign of steady deterioration. There were actually plenty of signs of improving relations between Armenian politicians and activists and their counterparts in the CUP government. This situation was repeatedly underlined by many first-hand witnesses in the region. In the introduction to his 1913-1914 annual report, the American missionary, Mr. Yarrow, in one, commented on the political situation and prospects. I quote, "It's with deep gratitude that we are able to announce that much of the anxiety and apprehension mentioned in our last annual report has passed. Politically, the year has been filled with grave possibilities, and the fact that the present outlook seems brighter than any year since the granting of Constitution ought to encourage all those who are praying for the pacification and advancement of this troubled region." Unquote. Likewise, Dr. Usher, in his 1914 report of one medical mission, described the past year as a year full of blessing, perhaps the best year in our history. On October 22, 1913, in the immediate aftermath of the killing of several infamous Kurdish brigands, the Armenian daily Byzantium correspondent observed that, I quote, "In the countryside, a very peaceful situation reigns. This situation has filled the inhabitants of the countryside with content because such tranquility has not been witnessed in the last quarter century." Unquote. What I've tried to establish so far was that the detrimental outcomes of the Balkan Wars did not lead the actors involved in the conflict in and over Eastern Anatolia to a deadlock. Despite the prevalence of anxiety and ongoing competition and conflict, emerging intercommunal crises could and in most cases were overcome through compromise of political elites. Community and political leaders compromised because they did not expect or predict an imminent catastrophic total collapse. Hence, coexistence continued to be the most viable option for the future as late as August 1914. And the prominent figures such as Zohrab, Bartles, and Gramian, and many others had solid reasons to be optimistic. This is not to say that the conflict ceased to exist, nor am I ignoring that ethnic or other forms of violence continue to be part of life, or the shadow of apprehension over everyday life stemming from communalist rivalries dissipate. Instead, I demonstrate that a precarious peace replaced the more aggressive social and political situation of the years 1911-12. Therefore, I conclude that the time period between the end of the Balkan Wars and World War I was not a prelude to the genocide, Armenian genocide, or to the overall catastrophe in the region. Myriad scenarios were possible. The catastrophic outcome was only one, perhaps the least foreseeable, and its occurrence was not warranted by what happened in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, but rather by political actors' decisions after the World War I broke out. Yet, these observations from the region would dramatically change as of December 1914. Following the first incursion of the Russian armies into Ottoman territories, in a January 26, 1915 letter to the new governor of Van, Cevdet Bey, Vramyan, the Dashnak deputy to Van, and one of the first high-profile victims of the genocide, regretfully observes the radical shift of affairs and sudden escalation. Recent incidents contain, I'm talking about some clashes between Armenian militia and government forces in the countryside in Van. Recent incidents contain in them the picture of an unfortunate reality. Yet it was not long ago, only a couple of months back, that Ottoman officials and Armenian political organization, that is Dashnak Sütyun, used to meet one and another and emphasize their sincere cooperation. We would at least not forget the passionate demonstration in support of Ottoman military conscription under the auspices of Dashnak Sütyun leader Aram, with drum and fife in the early days of the war mobilization in Van. In that mutual trust, something has changed, but it is undeniable that this pathetic reality was created after the outbreak of the war in November 1914. In conclusion, I have suggested that the escalation in the Armenian genocide was not gradual, cumulative, but rather quite a sudden and explosive process. Before going into the implications of this observation about the Armenian genocide, I have to just let me note that my framework and conceptualization definitely have bearings on how to understand the making of collective violence in general, and as well as on memory politics. But if we were to focus on the case of Armenian genocide, how and then does all of this change or not the way we understand the Armenian genocide? Surely, for a start, it offers a conceptual and analytical clarification of differentiating among background conditions, enabling conditions, and immediate precipitating causes of the catastrophe. Historical antecedents to the conflict, such as its violent record, imperial rivalry over the region, or the ideological compass of the perpetrators, did matter as the background condition of the genocide. World War I played a very crucial role in the escalation process. It created a political context, to adopt Martin Shaw's term, that became the most direct structural context of the Armenian genocide. True that analysts often manipulate the extraordinary wartime conditions as the source of all calamities. But true that modern warfare leads to unprecedented civilian casualties. But wars are not in and of themselves genocide, unless we stretch the term beyond any usefulness. The war brought into being a new political configuration that did not simply magnify, radicalize, or unravel the original positions of political actors, but rather created a new international, domestic, and local matrix of power relations. This matrix, in turn, set in motion and multiplied possibilities and opportunities. As a result, for instance, the CEU government moved from a more cautious, compromise-minded position aimed at keeping the tattered empire intact to a redemptive, more aggressive expansionist attempt to re-establish its might. Hence, the war was an enabling condition of the genocide, but by no means its complete explanation. More broadly, moving towards
moving beyond the etiologies of escalation bias leaves us with a arduous task, namely identifying precipitating causes of the massacres. More precisely, exploring the escalation and decision-making processes. In other words, how to unravel why and how major collective political actors following the outbreak of World War I made certain decisions which were unprecedented, unforeseeable, and alas, catastrophic. Let me open a parenthesis here and specify what I mean by these terms. Genocidal escalation and by these terms. Genocidal escalation and decision-making were not discrete and sequential moments, but were rather concentric and often concomitant processes. While escalation as a process addresses how the perpetrators had developed strategic, emotional, and ideological justifications that an exterminationist program was acceptable and even necessary, the associated process of decision-making, on the other hand, relates to how perpetrators had built up an authoritative consensus that such a politically and psychologically drastic and scope-wise gigantic undertaking was geopolitically, conscientiously, and logistically doable. Such a modification of focus also requires methodological and geographical and chronological shifts in our research design. First, methodologically, it entails excelling the constraints of a top-down approach. This requires, on the one hand, rethinking the spatial emphasis of conventional accounts, which almost exclusively center on the Ottoman territories, and particularly on Istanbul. On the other hand, it urges us to acknowledge multiplicity of actors involved in the process, which cannot be reduced to a few highest-level CUP leaders, Talat, Enver, Bahattin, Shakir, and others, and even to ideologues or even to local governors. In this context, understanding how collective actors were fractured along dissimilar war scenarios and competing institutional local interests is at least as much important as tracing the remaking of political agencies and reconfiguration of alliances. As a related methodological move, a comprehensive framework for the genocide needs to locate the destruction of non-Armenian communities of the region, such as Assyrians and Yazidis, as part of the broader catastrophe, rather than treating their ordeals as somewhat and remotely related concurrent events. Finally, such a methodological restructuring will demand fundamental modification in understanding the temporal dimensions of escalation and decision-making. Here it should be highlighted that genocidal escalation and decision-making were not discrete. I always said that they were not discrete processes, but they were concentric and often concomitant processes. And actually, what's the time right now? It's 6:30. So should wrap up. Okay. So here's the like a couple of comments about this map. This is what I'm doing, and this is what hopefully what you will be reading soon in my book. I basically trace the actors and their today I mostly talk about the period from June 1913 to August 1914. That's the outbreak of the First World War. And in the rest of my work, I basically follow the main actors involved in this conflict along these chronotopes. These are all chronotopes that I look at: Istanbul, Erzurum, Van, northern Iran, and Tiflis. And I basically trace these actors oftentimes day by day and see how the escalation and decision making actually took shape in the process. Thank you very much for your patience.